your host, JC Tevez.
Good evening, monsters. What's going on? Welcome to more hot conversations here on Heard on Thursdays, the show that made Philippine FM radio talk. I'm your host, JC Tevez. What's going on? Hope you're having a wonderful evening so far. And we've got an episode of Volcanic Impact for you tonight. Pun intended, yes. Now, the philosopher George Santayana is quoted as saying, "People never believe in volcanoes until the lava actually overtakes them." It's a saying that you might have heard in the past. I guess he means people never believe in the power of volcanoes, their capacity for destruction and creation as well. Because all we see is the beauty and majesty of volcanoes when they're asleep. Indeed, volcanoes have captured the romantic imagination of human beings since the dawn of history. Says the visionary filmmaker Werner Herzog, he went to volcanoes because there was a lot of mythology around them, something like the creation of gods and monsters and demons. An evangelist puts it this way: every volcano is a powerful illustration of God's character. God is a Vesuvius of goodness, life, and energy. If that's so, God may be trying to tell us something, right? Because one of our most beloved volcanoes, small but fierce, has been very restless the past 2 weeks. We all have heard the news, the Taal volcano. If it hasn't exactly spewed fire and brimstone, then at least potentially dangerous gas and ash. In fact, this week, several small eruptions were recorded of the Taal volcano. To find out what's up with Taal, what is it telling us? Well, how do we prepare for it? We invited the man himself. To help us understand volcanoes, we are honored to have the Undersecretary of the Department of Science and Technology, or DOST, and the OIC of the Philippine Institute of Volcanology and Seismology, or simply PHIVOLCS. Heard on Thursdays, we have joining us tonight USEC Renato Solidum Jr. USEC, welcome to the show. How are you?
Good evening to everyone.
Thank you for joining us. How are you? How's your night going so far? Thank you for staying up late for us.
No problem. I usually stay up late, especially now with Taal volcano erupting.
And I know that you're very busy with everything that's going on right now, especially at this time with Taal volcano being very restless. But the first question, Yusek, that I always ask all of my guests is, what have you been doing during this quarantine that's different from your job description, that doesn't involve volcanoes or earthquakes?
Well, surprisingly, I've been more busy now than before the pandemic because more people wanted to meet via the internet. But I find time to do other things. I'd like to watch movie if I can, or listen to songs, and sometimes do gardening and do exercise.
Nice. Would you now consider yourself a plantito? Because people
maybe, yes. But I've been used to gardening before. But now I think more people are doing this.
Great. Well, Yusek, let's talk about you because we were talking a little bit behind the scenes, and you really want to promote PHIVOLCS and everything that they're doing. But let's talk about you and how you ascended to the position that you're in. Let's talk about your expertise. How did you start? How did you get into the field of volcanoes?
Well, surprisingly, my becoming a geologist and working at PHIVOCS were not really intended. Well, I was supposed to do civil engineering, but in the University of the Philippines, there was a limit. There was a quota. So I was instructed to enroll in a non-quota course and transfer to engineering a semester later. But then I did not know that you have to line up early in the morning in UP. So I arrived at 8 o'clock in the morning, and all those non-quota courses were filled up. And so I panicked and scanned the brochure, and I saw geology was a non-quota course in the 1980. And I realized that I passed the room where the geology was being admitted. And the line was too short. And I hurriedly went there, and I was the second to the last to be admitted in that class. And I liked it. I did not transfer to the civil engineering department. And I graduated. And then later on, I had a subject. Usually, the subject handled by then Dr. Punong Bayan was quite difficult to finish because we were required to map a 25 by 25 square kilometers of the Sierra Madre. And that's a very large area. So the class divided the area into groups. And so unless everyone submitted their output, the class cannot submit the report. So
Yeah.
I had to wait for my last class to be approved by Dr. Punumbayan. And so I have to be going to PHIVOCS regularly. And at some point, he asked me if my grades are okay. I said yes. And he said, why don't you apply to PHIVOCS because there's a vacancy. I did not want to work in government because I wanted to work in a private corporation, being the eldest in the family, and I wanted to help my family. But it was just coincidence that he asked me to work at PHIVOCS. He said that the salary is not high, but I can do my graduate studies, be a PhD later, and more importantly, I have to return my service to the country, being a scholar of the country, scholar ng bayan.
Yes.
So that's the story.
Wow, that's pretty. I mean, it's in a way, it was just everything was by chance in a way.
Yes, yes, yes. My becoming a geologist and working at PHIVOCS was simply by chance. But I always have this philosophy: if God opens something for you and you take it, just do your best, and He will take care of you the rest of the way. And so that's my life. It was not really intentional to be a geologist and to work in government.
Yeah. Well, I mean, what is it about geology that made you, because you had no more desire to switch back to civil engineering or transfer to civil engineering. So what is it about geology that you think was that really kept you in that course, in that field, and made it a lifelong career?
It's funny, I'm from the province. I come from Romblon. And I only took an entrance exam at the University of the Philippines. I did not know that. And being from the province, I like going places. In high school, I used to go to different provinces to attend conferences or enter contests. And I think in one of the science quiz contests, regional contests, I encountered the word geology and geothermal. So I said, maybe this is a good thing to do. And when I enrolled in geology classes, it's fascinating because you apply many sciences and engineering in geology. This Catholic combination of sciences. When you study the earth, there are many branches of geology. Essentially, it's an earth science. You can study hard rocks, the lava. You can study soft rocks, the sediments. You can go to the oil industry. You can do geothermal. You can be a teacher. Or you can go around with PHIVOCS, going to places and studying volcanoes. And essentially, I realized that working at a certain government organization, which is really intended to serve the public and to take care of them by making sure that you provide them the right information to make them safer, is also a very good job. I think back then, in 1984, when I graduated, my intention was really to work, and I didn't really decide that I would work just for a specific company, although initially I wanted to work with a private organization. So geology is fun if you like it, but I think it's also scientifically challenging because you can use different sciences in studying geology. It's not simply studying rocks, but more importantly, trying to forecast what can happen in the future in certain line of work, like what we do at the Philippine Institute of Volcanology and Seismology.
And in a way, you could label yourself a rock star, right? In a way, because you're a rock expert. I think that would be a cool
Yes,
title.
I can do that, but sometimes it's funny because I encountered some situations when I was in the hospital and somebody would ask me about what I do, and I jokingly said, "Well, I specialize in stones." And he said, "Are you okay, doctor?" No, I'm studying simple rocks. But yes, I like it because I find fulfillment in what I do, and sometimes when I see people are really listening and following your advice to make them safer, it's really touching.
And that's why we have you here tonight. And actually, let's get to the question on a lot of people's minds right now. And pardon the pun. Let's talk about the explosive news that has been kind of going around about the Taal volcano. What exactly is its level of activity right now? What is its status right now?
We have certain alert levels for every volcano that we monitor. It starts from 0, which is normal, and number 5 is a state of where the volcano is already erupting explosively, and there's a danger that it can really harm people. So it's a state of the highest activity of the volcano. We're in the level of alert level 3, where magma has reached the surface and would produce explosions. Now, these explosions would all depend on how much gas the magma contains within it, because the gas would propel the explosion. It's just like having a bottle of soda, and when you shake it, you see the bubbles separating from the liquid. If you open the cap of the soda, the liquid would squirt out, right? But if you slowly uncap the bottle, the gases would slowly come out as well. And when you finally open the cap, the liquid would just stay there or squirt a little bit. So the presence of gases inside the magma would really make it more explosive. At this point, though, the magma at the surface or near the surface of Taal volcanoes degassed. Since February, where we had a lot of earthquakes, the gases were also escaping out of Taal volcano. That's why in some cases, there were large amounts of sulfuric dioxide gases coming out of the volcano, sometimes dispersed by winds to different areas. And in some cases, because of the moisture of the air and the wind was not so strong and the temperature was a little bit cold, the sulfur dioxide gases mixed with moisture, and the cloud of sulfur dioxide became a fog or smog, volcanic smog. And so it affected the surrounding areas of the volcano. So even though the explosion is occurring, it's not that explosive compared to the previous January 2020 eruption. So we're there. It's still dangerous, but right now we don't expect the explosion to be very large compared to the 2020 eruption if the condition stays. No? If, however, there's a new batch of magma rising from below and this would carry lots of gases, then we can find the eruptive activity change from an explosive but not so strong to a more explosive one.
I see. And are you in PHIVOLCS, are you able to predict the magma that might be coming? How far ahead can you predict in terms of let's say the magma and the bubbles rising? How far ahead can you predict that? Or is it
in
really
terms of telling people if it's dangerous and they need to evacuate? Okay. It's very uncertain exactly when a volcano would have a large explosion. So all volcanologists can do is to monitor what is happening. We monitor the earthquake events, just like putting a stethoscope on your chest and see what's inside. We also measure the gases. Measuring gases would be quite difficult if there would be large amount of sulfur dioxide gases coming out, because it's also dangerous, and if it's raining. But we also have instruments on the island aside from earthquakes. We have what we call electronic tilt. The ground may vary from horizontal to steep, and we can measure that in real time. We also have global positioning system or GPS receivers, and visually we can see what's happening with the volcano. So what we try to do is interpret these different signals and have this idea of processes occurring within the volcano, and we try to anticipate the next move of a volcano. So that's why when we have an increasing numbers or measurements of these different parameters, we also increase the alert level from 0 to 1 to 2 to 3 to 4. And with increasing alert level, the possibility of having a very large explosion that can harm people would also increase, and the time window or the possibility of an eruption would be constrained. Like, say, for example, if you talk about alert level 3, large hazardous explosion can happen within weeks if the trend would continue. If we raise it to 4, that kind of explosive activity can happen within days to hours. So that's how we actually manage monitoring and warning people. And every time we increase the alert, there is a corresponding response by the local government and by the residents. We increase the areas to be evacuated. However, Taal is a volcano that would show different types of eruption. It can explode like what happened last year. The worst case eruption of Taal would be horizontally moving clouds of ashes and rocks at speeds of more than 60 kilometers per hour. This can travel above water and reach the shoreline and even further inland. And way back in 1754, the eruption covered almost the whole coastal areas of Taal volcano and buried many towns under 1 to 3 meters of ashes. The account then of how many died is not so clear, but this eruption of 1754 led to the relocation of the center of Taal, of Lipa, of Tanawan, which were formerly on the lakeshore, to further out. For example, Taal town is now in Balayan Bay, many kilometers away from the lake. And so it is also possible that Taal volcano would just show some fireworks. And this happened in 1968 and 69. And then, if that is the case, I think most people will want to go to Tagaytay and view the fireworks, and it will not be very dangerous to people. So it all depends on the amount of gas and if ever there will be new magma coming from below. So far, we don't see that yet. We just see shallow level magma with less gas. So it is still dangerous, but not so compared to last year.
Right, I see. You mentioned, Yusek, that you have all these precautions, and when it comes to, so that you can increase the level, just in case your readings with the instruments. But is there a way to go against Mother Nature? Can volcanic eruptions be avoided or averted? Is there anything that humans can do, or is it really just it's up to Mother Nature, up to the will of
Yes,
Mother Nature?
we cannot prevent the volcano from erupting. The energy that the volcano will actually show will be so powerful, and we cannot do something about it. What we can do is to avoid the wrath of the volcano. It's very simple. If the volcano is angry, well, don't go near it. If you have to go further away. Remember, the volcano actually formed our land. The volcano was formed by an eruption, and its slopes in the surrounding areas were actually built by a volcanic eruption. So we have to be aware that when the volcano is really active and angry, we have to avoid the areas it built because we can be affected by it. So it's very simple. The thing, though, is we cannot have towns and villages evacuate every time a volcano would threaten to erupt, because their lives will be disrupted. There will be severe economic losses. So it is a matter of a balance between development and the volcano's hazard. So we can actually have some appropriate land use where people can stay, where people can actually use the land, use the lake. But then essentially the settlement where they should be a little bit further away from the volcano. I think that is very easy to do in volcanoes which are conical, or it's a mountain or a hill, and you just run away from the crater. But that volcano is kind of very unique because it's on an island, and that volcano can actually devastate areas around it, even across the water. And many of the towns around Taal volcano are sitting on a bigger volcano. We call that Taal caldera, as the Taal lake is a big crater. So it's like you're located in a ball. So if you want to be safer from the volcano, you have to run away from it, climb the mountain, which is actually the crater rim of the bigger volcano, and go beyond it so that you'll be safer from Taal. So this
Yes.
situation is a little bit different from the rest of our volcanoes. More
And
difficult
actually,
at a volcano eruption.
yeah, and last year you mentioned the explosions from last year were a little bit more severe than what we're experiencing right now. And I recall being here in Metro Manila during that time. There was ash fall around NCR, but pardon me if I sound naive, but I think the last major eruption that NCR residents really had a direct experience of, was it Mount Pinatubo in 1991? Was that the most recent where it really affected a lot of people in NCR?
Yes, that's the most recent because Metro Manila can be affected either by the eruption of Pinatubo or Taal volcano. And so the most recent uh, big eruption or major eruption occurred in Pinatubo in 1991, 30 years ago. And so that was really devastating because the sky became dark and it seemed that there's a rain of snow in many areas. Well, of course, Taal had some major explosions before,
Mhm.
not only the recent one last year. Compared to previous eruptions, last year's explosion was not so big, but
Yes.
still big compared to now.
Mhm.
But in 1911 and in other bigger eruptions, hundreds of years ago, ashes would have been felt in Metro Manila.
What constitutes a major eruption? What are the characteristics, or how would you? Is it just because it looks like the world is gonna end? What is a major eruption in terms of PHIVOLCS description of it?
Well, a major eruption is a relative term, but
Yeah.
typically it's an eruption where you can see very tall eruption columns, like more than 10 kilometers, 15 kilometers. You see widespread deposition of volcanic ash, of the flows of rocks and ashes down slopes of volcanoes can reach further, maybe several tens of kilometers. And and that is really a very dangerous eruption where many people are impacted by it.
Mhm.
Volcanologists, though, have a way to characterize the explosion or eruption of a volcano by the volume of materials that are erupted. It's like for earthquakes, there's a magnitude scale, the energy of the earthquake released when faults move. So in volcanoes, we measure the volume of how much ashes and rocks are either expelled or would slowly get out of a crater. So, for example, for Mount Pinatubo in 1991, it's roughly around 10 cubic kilometers of ash. So, this has an equivalent of volcano explosivity index. That's what the term is, which is analogous to magnitude of around 6. For many of the eruptions of Taal would be 1 or 2. Now, for example, the 1754 eruption of Taal might be around 4 only. So those eruptions with the volcano explosivity index of maybe 3 or 4 can be considered major. But of course, ordinary people would not be able to determine that. But
Mhm.
physically, they would see very tall eruption columns, ashes raining in many areas, impacting not only people but also houses and vegetation, and can be widespread deposition of ashes on the slopes, just like
Yes.
what happened in Pinatubo in 1991.
Yeah, and speaking since 1991 was, and I was so surprised when you met. I mean, it just caught me off guard. It was 30 years ago. It seems like the 90s were just 10 years ago, but it's been almost 30 years since it happened. So a lot of our listeners, they weren't alive yet to experience that. So most of the people who haven't experienced a volcanic eruption of that magnitude, their only idea or visual perception of a volcano is usually through movies like Dante's Peak and Volcano. Uh, First of all, are you a fan of those kinds of disaster movies, and how accurate do they portray a a epic volcanic eruption?
I like movies, whether they are correct or not, or true or not. But for Dante's Peak, I know that they have consulted United States Geological Survey or USGS volcanologists for scientific background. There were many scenes there that are okay. There was a reference on Pinatubo by the lead actor Pierce Brosnan. They had a scene where people died because of volcanic gases in a bubbling pool. It did not happen in Pinatubo, of course, but this was mostly correct, except that when they were running away from a lava flow, the tires of the jeep that they were using did not get burned. So it was surprising. It's a super tire. So, and that's one funny thing. When, of course, I wasn't laughing because I was in the US then studying. But
I see.
oh yeah, that scene was not okay. But most often, most of the scenes there are okay. For the volcano, I think that was the movie set in LA. Of course, there will be no volcanic eruption in LA.
Yeah.
There were bubbling pits there, the La Brea pits, but not because of volcanic gases, but oil. And well, the movie was good to watch with all these effects, but of course, that was not realistic to happen in LA.
I see. What about because you mentioned that when it comes to, let's say, the lava, you were able to spot immediately like this is completely wrong. But is there something that maybe a lot of people tend to believe, or maybe a question that gets asked of you a lot that surprises you, like, oh, that's actually very wrong? Is there a notion, a popular notion about volcanoes that you want to dispel, or say, this is actually like a common misconception about volcanoes? That's what I meant to say.
Yeah.
Is there a common misconception about volcanoes you want to address to our listeners?
Well, there are several things, but let me just maybe cite a common example, but very important. When people are asked the major hazard of a volcano, they're always quoting lava flow, because you can see a river of molten rocks flowing down the slope. Because red is hot, they think they will get burned by the lava flow. Well, if they've seen documentaries or movies of lava flows in Hawaii, the lava flows in Hawaii are fast. They're very fast moving. Compared to the lavas in the Philippines, the lavas in the Philippines are viscous. They don't move very fast, like they have speeds of 1 kilometer per day.
Oh, wow.
So you should not die because of a lava flow, right? If you die from it, then there's something wrong with you. Because it's so slow. So you don't go towards the lava flow because there are boulders that might roll down. But the real hazard from a volcanic eruption is the pyroclastic flow. It's the movement of hot rocks and gases downslope at speeds of more than 60 kilometers per hour. In Taal volcano, it's not really moving downslope because there's not much slope in Taal. What happens in Taal, though, is that because of the big crater, and sometimes the eruption would occur on the side of the island, the eruption or explosion is essentially unconfined. So there are cases where the explosion isn't only vertical, but there's a horizontal trajectory. So in dangerous eruptions of Taal, and that was the scenario we were worried about last year and even this year, is that there can be horizontal moving clouds that will cross the lake and reach further out. We call that base surge. So those are the most dangerous hazard, not the lava flow.
There we go. Good to know. I'm sure a lot of our listeners just learned something new, as I did right now for the first time. Good to know about that. What about the relationship between volcanoes and earthquakes? Because of course it's the Philippine Institute of Volcanology and Seismology. What is the relationship between the two? How related are they when it comes to eruptions? And does an earthquake ever cause a eruption, or vice versa? Does a volcano eruption cause an earthquake?
Okay, very good question. Just a trivia. Prior to 1984, we were called the Philippine Institute of Volcanology. The letter S there was with PAGASA, because back then the seismology function was with PAGASA. But PAGASA focuses mostly on things that occur above the ground.
Yes.
So it was a wise decision to transfer the seismology function to PHIVOLCS, to become PHIVOCS, because both are really related to Earth's processes. When I am being asked to explain the difference between Pagasa and PHIVOCS scientists, I call PHIVOCS scientists are the earthly ones, or makamundong scientista of DOST, because we focus on processes below the ground, and we call
Yeah,
the scientists from Pagasa the heavenly ones, makalangit, because they focus on the ground. But talking about volcanoes and earthquakes, volcanoes are accompanied by earthquakes when there's an activity. But the earthquake events related to volcano activities are not that strong.
Okay.
Earthquake events, though, that are generated by movement of faults are really strong, and those are the earthquakes that can devastate a wide area. When there's a nearby earthquake, it can actually trigger the eruption of a volcano if there's a magma beneath the volcano ready to be erupted. A good example is the 1991 eruption of Mount Pinatubo. A year before, almost a year before the eruption of Pinatubo, July 16, 1990, occurred a big earthquake, magnitude 7.8. And the idea is that the earthquake wave that passed through Pinatubo, because the earthquake is a wave, compressed the volcano and enabled somewhat the squeezing of a magma below the earth, below the Pinatubo, to rise towards the shallower level and interacted with a shallow level magma and caused the eruption. So a strong earthquake can trigger an eruption of the volcano if there's magma to be erupted. But if the volcano does not have magma inside it, there will be no eruption.
I see.
So it is important to understand that it's the earthquake influencing the volcano and not the other way around.
Okay, well, good to know. And Yusek, there's been a fear among people about a potential big earthquake, like the big one. Is that just a rumor, or is that something that people shouldn't really worry about? People are worried sometimes when they buy their houses or their condominiums. They ask, is it on the fault line? Is there a potential big earthquake that could destroy a lot of the country, for example? Is that something that we should be worried about?
In Metro Manila, yes, and in other places in the Philippines. The only place in the Philippines that are not really affected by strong ground shaking or earthquake shaking is mainland Palawan. There are many active faults crisscrossing the Philippine archipelago, and there are earthquake generators on the sides of the island on both the eastern and western side. One of our goals in PHIVOCS, DOST PHIVOCS, is to really prepare scenarios. Like, based on science, we can predict what can happen in the future by developing scenarios that are based on facts. We actually develop scenarios for eruption. The potential of a large explosion for a volcano is studied out of the rocks of the volcano. The potential large earthquake that can affect any place in the Philippines can be glimpsed by mapping the different active faults in the country. So we have geologists, which I call fault finders. They map where the faults are and try to really understand how often these earthquakes would move. Way back in 2002 to 2004, we had a project with Japan International Cooperation Agency and Metro Manila Development Authority with PHIVOCS, and we developed an earthquake scenario. We studied 18 earthquake scenarios all over Metro Manila and surrounding provinces, and we determined which earthquake will cause devastation in Metro Manila. And we have two scenarios that we are using for Metro Manila's preparedness and even provinces surrounding Metro Manila. The first scenario is the movement of a known active fault crossing Metro Manila, partly Rizal, Bulacan, and also Cavite, Laguna. We call that the Valley Fault System. It is composed of two faults. The western side of it, the West Valley Fault, is longer, around 100 kilometers. It can generate a magnitude 7.2 earthquake. If the whole length of the fault will move, it can generate an intensity 8 shaking. An intensity 8 shaking is typically where you cannot stand during the shaking, and the duration of the shaking can be more than 30 seconds to a minute. Houses and buildings are designed And if properly built and used standard materials, they can withstand intensity 8 shaking.
Okay.
The problem, though, is that there are many buildings that are non-engineered, houses that were built and not supervised by civil engineers or architects. And there are also old buildings that should be retrofitted or strengthened. And that scenario was called by the media the big one. The
The big one,
second
yes.
scenario that we actually are preparing for would be an earthquake from offshore along the what we call the Manila Trench. A trench is where a part of the ocean would dive beneath it, beneath an island, and that can cause a tsunami in Metro Manila, and of course the surrounding provinces along the western side of Luzon and down to Mindoro and Palawan. That can also shake Metro Manila strongly, but the impact will be much less than the shaking from the West Valley Fault. However, the waves from a tsunami can reach Metro Manila with a height of maybe 6 meters if we add the height of the tsunami and the high tide. And that can devastate areas within 3 kilometers from the shoreline. And so we study those, we study the possible impact, number of people that can be affected, so that the national government and the local governments can prepare accordingly. We cannot prepare appropriately if we don't develop those scenarios. You need to know how many people will be affected,
Yes.
how many buildings will be affected, which buildings will be affected, so that you can properly plan in advance how you respond to it, and more importantly, how you prevent the impact from being realized.
How far along do you think we are, at least here in NCR, in terms of how prepared we are for, let's say, the big one were to happen? What kind of steps has PHIVOLCS taken already in terms of campaigns, or maybe, let's say, here in our building, we always have an earthquake drill. But what else do we have to improve upon? Is it just awareness? Is it more of spreading the word? What are the challenges to getting everyone prepared? Because it's I'm sure it's quite a challenge, because there's so many people, so many different buildings with different that like you mentioned, some weren't maintained, or when they were built, they weren't looked over by civil engineers. So what are the steps that we have to take to become ready for? Hopefully it doesn't happen, but if it does, the worst.
Okay. Of course, awareness was the first step. The development of these scenarios and the results came out when I was already the director. The study was between 2002 to 2004, and I became the director in 2003, January. So I was actually the one going around the different cities together with MMDA explaining things. And I was the one explaining what will happen to Metro Manila. And of course, awareness would be the first step. People should be able to imagine the disaster that can happen. I call that disaster imagination. Unless you have that imagination of what can happen, you will not be able to own what needs to be done, because the next step after awareness is really implementing things, right? And there are many things that need to be implemented. To really reduce the impact of an earthquake, we need to strengthen houses and buildings. So we can really design and construct buildings that can withstand intensity 8 earthquake before and now and into the future. The real problem is what happens with those that are really constructed and people are staying there. So,
Yes.
so we make sure that the local governments really focus on this. It will take time. Government has also to look into critical government buildings for retrofitted. So there are campaigns to really strengthen schools, hospitals, and other important buildings. We need to strengthen roads, possibly construct multiple roads in and out of Manila. Like, for example, we have NLEX. We have to have another highway parallel to it, because NLEX can also be affected by an earthquake. We have the Candaba Swamp, where you pass this, it's really soft. Even the SLEX, the South Luzon Expressway. We need to have alternative airports and ports, not only in Manila. But more importantly, we need to plan so that we have a steady supply of food and water and energy after a major earthquake event. We need to make sure that we have enough responders that will help Metro Manila rescue and treat people. And so, because of the scenarios that we have, and again, thinking of the different impacts that every place in Metro Manila can be affected with. For example, if you think of the geography of Manila, we have the Pasig River in the middle, we have the Marikina River on the east. If bridges along these rivers would be destroyed by the earthquake, mobility across these different rivers would be affected, and Metro Manila can be temporarily isolated into at least 4 zones. So these scenarios were already formulated, and government, through the National Disaster Risk Reduction Management Council, had already assigned which local government, which units of the armed forces would go to different cities of Metro Manila. The thing, though, is assigning LGUs and units of the armed forces, it's one thing, and making sure that they are capable to really rescue and treat people is another thing. So capacity building between cities and the LGUs assigned and the armed forces need to be continued. Prior to the pandemic, I've been to some towns where I speak, where they have already made arrangements of really capacitating their counterpart. For example, I remember Pasig City with Mayor Pico and Isabela. No, they were already meeting and discussing so that Isabela responders could get familiarized with Pasig City. When buildings are still there, it's okay. You can easily remember but when these things are destroyed, even though you're familiar, you might not be familiar after the earthquake, but at least they get familiarized. We need to continue capacitating people within Metro Manila and outside. If the earthquake will not happen, then it's okay because more people know what to do and we can help others that are affected. Now, is it really necessary to do things now? To do these things now? Yes.
Yes.
The interval of movement of the West Valley Fault is between 400 to 600 years. And the last strong earthquake that occurred along this fault occurred in 1658, I think. So we're close to the 400 lower limit of the movement of the fault. It may not happen. There's another 200 years because of the 600-year, 400 to 600-year interval. But what if the earthquake happens soon? We're not that ready. We need to do this. Why am I saying that we need to act fast? Based on our analysis, around 38% of residential buildings, that is 1 to 9th story, public buildings and mid-rise buildings can be affected with slight to heavy damage. That's still a lot. But with time, though, we hope that this can be changed. It will not happen overnight. It will involve the whole of government, the whole of society approach, especially those that can help their employees. Private companies should also focus on not only strengthening their assets for their businesses, but more importantly, making sure that their employees and the families of their employees are also made aware what can happen during a strong earthquake and possibly help them to strengthen their own houses. Why is it important? Because businesses are affected if employees do not go to work. We saw this during COVID, right? So it's a very wise decision and the business strategy, not only to make sure that our assets are not destroyed, but also the very important asset of the company or the business would be the people. So we should also help them. We have lots of things to do, and the national government has prepared many plans, and we just need to implement it. But we need to continue to improve and really involve more people in this endeavor.
There we go. Let's make it happen. And you mentioned COVID, USEC. You're also the USEC of the Department of Science and Technology, or DOST. Let's talk a little bit about the DOST. What are the ongoing projects right now that you'd like to tell our listeners about? I'm sure you have a lot going on. What projects is the DOST working on right now that you?
Well, the Department of Science and Technology has so many agencies attached to it, and it's divided into scientific and technical services that would involve disaster monitoring and warning, PHIVOCS sa Pag-asa. We're also involved in the education, the Science Education Institute that provides scholarship to undergraduates and graduates, the Philippine Science High School, Science Advocacy. I handle those agencies. The other component of DOST is the Research and Development Institute. And we have been looking into many things that would help our economy, helping the micro, small, and medium enterprises and also big businesses. But one of the notable things that we want to do in terms of this lesson from the pandemic is the Department of Science and Technology would want to establish the Virology Institute of the Philippines, which would focus on studying diseases, viruses that can inflict not only people but animals. You have heard of the African swine uh,
Yes.
flu, right? So it is
Mm-hmm.
important, fever. It is important for us to do that. But during the pandemic, we have transitioned from really doing things and focusing many of the projects to alleviate what we are experiencing from COVID, from prevention. Like we have developed this uh, smart and swift travel management software called XPass that is being used now for mobility management for people to go to different places. We have developed masks, ventilators. We are the ones doing the implementation of vaccine testing. We're developing possible medicines uh, or drugs for certain diseases. And it was very good for DOST to have a test kit financed, and this was developed uh, by a doctor in UP Manila. And this test kit was for dengue, because dengue is a very dangerous uh, sickness. And they transitioned the test kit into a COVID testing very
Wow.
fast. So we now have a locally made test kit. We have many things being done, and aside from the concern for health, we're also moving. We have a lot of things to do for our economic development. You have heard of the trains, the hybrid trains, the automated guided transit. These are being continued because we also have to worry about climate change. We need to
Mm-hmm.
have clean production, less energy. We need to protect the environment. So we focus on health, we focus on livelihood and business, we focus on safety, like PHIVOCS and Pagasa, and we are developing our future, the students, through our science education and scholarships
Yes.
through Science Education Institute and the Philippine Science High School.
I love that. Yeah, and on that note, actually, since we have a lot of young, impressionable audience members listening on the Monster every day, even just talking to you tonight, I'm sure a lot of people have learned the importance of civil engineers and geologists and working in the sciences. So, what can you tell our young audience that can make them interested in studying? Taking up a career in any of those fields. How do you convince someone to become a geologist as someone who fell in love with the science.
Well, if you're passionate on something, just go with it. I think every job is very important in the country, but in terms of science and technology, we need to be really focusing on science and engineering, agriculture, and math in terms of encouraging more people to go into that
Mhm.
because our livelihood is being replaced with artificial intelligence, with computers.
Mhm.
Um, but also, very important, we have to have our health professionals also with us, with the scientists, because maybe this is not only the time we will face pandemic, as we actually disturb our environment. We are impinging on the habitat of wild animals. There might be similar cases where viruses from animals can transfer to humans. So every profession is important. So just follow your dream, follow your passion, and just do your best. In my case, I did not intend to be a geologist, but when I was exposed, I try to do my best in classes that I take. So, and when you do your best, you actually love it, and there will be opportunities for you. Um, my goal then was to have a job, But being in government, the intent was to help the country, help our countrymen. And I think if that is the case, then where your heart is, you will be led there. So for our audience, I have 5 things to mention to you to be successful in life. I call it the earthly qualities to be successful. First
Perfect.
is strive to be excellent. And when you want to excel, you have to study. You have to learn from other people, informal education, from your bosses, from your peers, and even your subordinates. Second is aim right. Follow the right path. You can be very good, but you might be applying what you know in bad things. So aim right, no? So EA, no? And then when you relate to people, you always have to treat people with respect, no matter what the economic status is or educational status. If you want to excel, you also have to learn to work with others. And you need to trust people so that you can work with others. So that's EARNT. But the most important thing in your profession, if you want to be successful, is where is your heart? Because where your passion is, that is where you want to go. Okay? And for me, the most important factor there is heart. So if letter H is more important, you transfer the letter H in front of the word earth, so it will become from earth to become the word heart. Huh? So those are the earthly qualities that I follow. You can apply that in your life, but of course you can do your own own things. No, you can choose what you want, but again, that is my advice for our youth.
Well, thank you so much for those wise words, heart or earth, whatever you want to call it. Follow that, and I think you're going to be just as successful right here as Yusek. Yusek, thank you so much for joining us this evening. Is there anyone you want to say hello to? Friends, family that are joining us, listening
I'm
for
not
us
sure
today?
if they're listening, but well, thank you again for this opportunity, JC, and for all our listeners. I'm very glad to be with you in this program, and I hope you got something out of our conversation. Thank you.
Definitely. We learned a lot. And hopefully, the next time we have you here, it'll be in the booth, live and in person. Hopefully, there's no eruption going on. We maybe just an update for all the listeners out there. But thank you once again to Yusek Renato Solidum Jr. for joining us this evening. Join us again next week for more hot conversations here on Heard on Thursdays. My name is JC Teves. Always keep it locked right here on